When Karen sees a suspicious man sitting on a porch, she calls the cops, only to discover he's Shaquille O'Neal, the legend himself. But when Shaq reveals a buried truth about Karen's past, the neighborhood's perfect façade shatters. One accusation, one secret, one night that changes everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The sun hung lazily over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns of Willow Creek, a place where every house looked like it had been pulled straight from a luxury real estate catalog. It was the kind of neighborhood where silence was golden, and the only disturbances were the occasional barks of over-pampered golden retrievers, or the low hum of Teslas pulling into their pristine driveways. Big Shaq leaned back on his porch chair, a glass of iced tea resting on the table beside him. His towering frame barely fit into the chair, but he looked at ease, lost in the quiet hum of the afternoon. The world had slowed down for him after retirement. No roaring crowds, no flashing cameras, just the occasional charity event and a life he had carefully built away from the spotlight. Across the street, Karen Calloway, mid-40s, blonde bob cut sharp enough to slice through her perfect suburban façade, peeked through her curtains. The sight of him, this massive dark-skinned man sitting alone, relaxed, made her uneasy. She didn't recognize him. Or maybe she did. Maybe she had seen his face before. Maybe her husband had watched one of his games years ago. But that didn't matter. To her, in that moment, he wasn't Big Shaq, the legend. He was a stranger, a looming figure where he didn't belong. Her fingers curled around her phone. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's voice dropped to a hushed whisper. There's a suspicious man outside. He looks dangerous. The dispatcher on the other end remained neutral. Can you describe him? Karen's breath hitched. He's big. Really big. He's just sitting there. A pause. The dispatcher's tone remained level. Is he doing anything illegal, ma'am? Karen hesitated. The truth? No, he wasn't. But that didn't stop her. He's staring. I don't feel safe. It didn't take long. Sirens. Flashing lights. The sharp screech of tires cutting through the quiet afternoon. 3 patrol cars pulled up in front of Shaq's house, doors flying open, hands inching toward holsters. The once quiet street became a stage for something ugly, something Shaq had seen play out too many times before. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give them a reason to say he was reaching for something. The lead officer, a lean man with a tense jaw and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward. Sir, I need you to stand up. Shaq exhaled slowly, placing his glass of tea down with deliberate calm. His voice, deep and steady, carried none of the frustration bubbling inside him. This is my house. The officer hesitated. Doubt. It flickered across his face for a fraction of a second. But Karen, now standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed over her chest, didn't waver. She pointed a manicured finger toward Shaq's porch. He was just sitting there, watching, like he was planning something. Shaq let out a slow, measured breath. He had heard it all before. The accusations wrapped in fear. The way his existence, his mere presence, was twisted into a threat. It didn't matter that he had donated millions to charities, that he had put countless kids through school, that he had made a life out of giving back. All they saw was a big black man in a rich neighborhood. I need you to show me some ID, the officer pressed. Shaq could feel his pulse in his ears. He wasn't going to argue, wasn't going to give them what they wanted. Anger, resistance, a reason. So, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. His retired NBA card was still tucked inside, right next to his ID. The officer's eyes flicked down to the name. Recognition dawned. Shaquille O'Neal. Silence. Then, a shift. A ripple of discomfort passed through the officers. The cop standing next to the car let out a short, awkward laugh. Wait. Hold up. You're... Shaq didn't smile, didn't joke. He just held the officer's gaze, watching the slow realization sink in. You were about to arrest me in front of my own house. The weight of it settled in the air between them. But Karen? She wasn't ready to back down. Her arms were still folded, her jaw still tight. I don't care who he is. He was acting suspicious. You can't just sit on someone's porch and expect people to be okay with it. Shaq turned to her then, really looked at her. Not with anger, not with hatred, just disappointment. You ever stop to think, he said, his voice measured, that the problem isn't me sitting here, but you not being able to handle it? Karen's face twitched. I was protecting my neighborhood, she snapped. I was protecting my family. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his size casting a long shadow across the porch. From what? A long silence stretched between them. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted on their feet. One of them muttered something into his radio. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Her confidence was cracking, splintering like glass under pressure. Shaq shook his head, exhaling slow and deep. This isn't about me, he said, almost to himself. It never is. The officers exchanged glances. The situation had changed, and they knew it. There was no crime, no reason to arrest him. One by one, they backed toward their cars. Karen, still standing there, wasn't ready to let it go. She had spent her life believing that she was right, that her fear justified her actions, that her world was safe because she controlled who belonged in it. But today, the world wasn't bending for her. For the first time, Karen Calloway felt small. The officers left without another word, and the flashing lights disappeared down the road. Shaq stood up slowly, his massive frame unfolding, towering, but never threatening. He picked up his iced tea, took a slow sip, and walked inside without looking back. He had nothing to prove. But Karen? She had everything to learn. The neighborhood of Willow Creek had always been a picture of perfection. White picket fences, manicured lawns, and driveways lined with luxury cars. It was the kind of place where families waved politely, where holiday decorations were tastefully extravagant, and where every face in the local grocery store was familiar. On the surface, it was welcoming, safe, and warm, but only for the right kind of people. Shaq had known it the moment he moved in. He wasn't naive. He'd seen that look before. The hesitant glances, the forced smiles, the unspoken questions behind the neighborly greetings. Why is he here? Does he really belong? Isn't he more of a downtown type? No one had ever said it outright, of course. That would be rude. Instead, it lurked beneath their politeness, a silent rule unspoken but understood. Tonight, as the flashing lights faded down the street and the last police car disappeared from sight, Shaq stood on his porch, gripping the cold glass of his half-melted iced tea. His neighborhood had just tried to remove him from his own home, and the people who had smiled at him for months, the same ones who had sent polite waves from across the street, had watched it happen. Karen was still standing near her driveway, arms crossed tight against her chest, eyes darting between Shaq's house and the retreating taillights. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't apologetic. If anything, she was angry, not at herself, not at what had just happened, but at the fact that it hadn't gone the way she wanted. A few neighbors had stepped out onto their porches, pretending to check their mail or water their plants, their curiosity thinly veiled. They didn't intervene. They didn't pick a side. They just watched, as if waiting to see whether the neighborhood's balance would restore itself. Shaq exhaled, slow and controlled, and finally spoke. You called the cops on me for sitting on my porch. His voice was even, but it carried the weight of something deeper. Disappointment, exhaustion, a quiet fury that simmered beneath the surface. Karen scoffed, shifting her weight. You were watching. You were just sitting there. It felt off. Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. Sitting on my own property felt off? She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze flickered toward the other houses, as if looking for silent support from the other neighbors peeking from their windows. None of them came forward. None of them ever did. I was protecting my home, Karen added after a moment, defensive now. We have a right to feel safe here. We. The word hung in the air like a barrier, drawing a clear line between her kind of people and everyone else. Shaq shook his head. Safe from what? Me? Karen's jaw tightened. Look, I don't expect you to get it, she muttered. People like me. She stopped herself, but it was too late. Shaq's eyebrows lifted. People like you? Silence stretched between them. Karen's expression hardened, but her fingers twitched at her sides. She was getting uncomfortable. Good. Shaq took a slow step forward, not to intimidate, but to close the distance between the truth and the lie Karen had been living in. I've been here almost 3 years, he said, voice steady. I've donated to your kids' schools, paid for the new basketball court at the recreation center, sponsored your husband's charity gala, but none of that matters, does it? Karen blinked, her posture rigid. You see me and you think danger, Shaq continued. You don't know a damn thing about me, but that doesn't matter, does it? Because to you, I don't belong. Karen bristled, straightening her spine. That's not fair. You're twisting my words. Shaq chuckled again, but there was no humor in it. Am I? Across the street, an older man named Richard Lawson, one of the neighborhood's longest-standing residents, stepped off his porch. He was in his early 60s, balding, dressed in a navy robe and slippers. He had lived in Willow Creek long before it had become the exclusive, gated paradise it was today. Shaq, he called, his voice gruff but not unkind. Let it go, son. Shaq turned his gaze toward him. Richard had always been the moderate one. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice. But he also never challenged anything. I should just let it go, Shaq asked, his voice quieter now, but sharper. Richard sighed. You know how this neighborhood is. That was the problem. He did. Shaq looked at the faces still watching from their porches. Some had their arms crossed. Others stood with their hands in their pockets, pretending not to listen. But they were all waiting for the moment to pass. He could let it. He could nod, go inside, pretend it never happened. He could be the bigger person, the way his mother had always taught him to be. Or he could make them see it. This isn't just about tonight, Shaq said, turning back to Karen. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, reaching every doorstep on the block. It's about the way people like you make the rules without ever saying them out loud. Karen's mouth pressed into a thin line. You act like this place is welcoming, Shaq continued. But people like me, we're just guests. The moment we stop entertaining, stop performing, stop making you feel comfortable, we're a problem. Karen's eyes flashed with something. Guilt, anger, maybe both. Shaq let the silence settle before speaking again. I could have been anybody tonight, he said. A kid walking home from practice, a father picking up his daughter from a play date. And you still would have called. Karen's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Shaq took a breath. Then, finally, he did what the neighborhood had been waiting for. He let it go. Not because they deserved it, but because he refused to give them the satisfaction of thinking they had the power to break him. He turned, stepping toward his front door. Before he went inside, he glanced back one last time, locking eyes with Karen. I hope one day, he said, you understand what you did tonight. Karen's expression flickered, just for a second. Then Shaq closed the door behind him. And outside, the neighborhood returned to its quiet, uneasy silence. The night was still. The neighborhood had fallen into silence, but inside his home, Shaq sat alone in his dimly lit living room, staring at the ice melting in his glass. His mind wasn't in Willow Creek anymore. It had traveled back to a different place, a different time. Newark, New Jersey, 1985. The air was thick with summer heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made the pavement feel like it was alive. A young Shaquille O'Neal, all awkward limbs and unpolished confidence, walked home from school with his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had learned to keep his head down, to not draw attention, even though that was nearly impossible when you were already bigger than most grown men at 13. That day, he had made a mistake. He had answered a math question too quickly, too confidently. The teacher had smiled, but the boys in the back of the classroom hadn't. Think you're smarter than us, huh, big dummy? They followed him after school, not running, not shouting, just walking close enough to remind him that he was a target. Shaq knew how this would go. He was bigger, stronger, but if he fought back, he'd be the aggressor. The threat. The school wouldn't ask questions. His mother would have to leave work early. His stepfather would shake his head and remind him that the world would always see him differently. So he did what he always did. He kept walking. But that day, it wasn't enough. One of them, a wiry kid with too much to prove, shoved him hard. Shaq stumbled but didn't fall. The other boys laughed. Then came the word. That word. It wasn't the first time he had heard it. But this time, it hit different. Maybe because he was older. Maybe because there was no mistaking what it meant now. Something burned in his chest, something hot and ugly. He clenched his fists, his knuckles aching from how hard he was gripping his backpack strap. His mother's voice echoed in his head. You have to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. He had wanted to hit them, had wanted to wipe the smirks off their faces. Instead, he had walked away. But that moment had stayed, lodged in his memory like a shard of glass, impossible to remove. 1990. A different kind of lesson. The first time he was falsely accused, he was 17. A local store owner had reported a suspicious tall black male wandering near the parking lot. Shaq had been nowhere near the store. He had been playing basketball at the park, sweating under the streetlights, dreaming about the NBA. But that didn't matter. 2 officers had pulled up beside him, lights flashing, radios crackling. One of them placed a hand on his holster. The other barked questions. Where were you an hour ago? You match the description. Don't make this difficult. He had tried to explain. He had pointed at the basketball bouncing next to his foot, at the other kids still playing. But he had seen it in their eyes. They had already made up their minds. Shaq's breath had come in short, sharp bursts. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had never been in trouble before, never even skipped class. But that didn't matter. In that moment, he was guilty just for existing. The officers had only let him go when a woman, Miss Holloway, his high school English teacher, had stormed out of a nearby cafe, demanding to know why they were harassing one of her best students. Had she not been there? Had she not vouched for him? He wasn't sure what would have happened. That was the night he realized the truth. Money wouldn't save him. Fame wouldn't save him. Even if he made it out of Newark, he would always be seen the same way. And now, sitting in his home in Willow Creek, years removed from the boy he had been, he felt that same weight pressing down on his chest. 1992. The price of a name. The draft had changed his life. One moment, he had been a kid from Newark with big dreams. The next, he was Shaquille O'Neal, NBA phenomenon. The endorsements rolled in. The money piled up. The world cheered. But the world also watched. Suddenly, everything he did was under scrutiny. The first time he tried to buy a luxury car, the salesman had laughed. You sure you can afford that? When he moved into his first mansion, the neighbors had assumed he was renting it. So, what do you do? It had been exhausting, the constant need to prove himself, even after he had already made it. And now it was happening again, on his own porch. Shaq let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down his face. The past wasn't just something he had lived through. It was still here, still following him. The ice in his drink had completely melted. He pushed the glass aside and leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. Karen's face flashed in his mind, the certainty in her eyes when she had called the cops, the way she had clung to her fear like it was justified. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. But this time, he wouldn't just walk away. Karen Calloway had built her world carefully. Everything in her life had a place, a sense of order, a logic that made her feel safe. She lived in a nice neighborhood, surrounded by nice people who all wanted the same thing: peace, security, predictability. And then there was Shaquille O'Neal, sitting on his porch, not fitting into that world. She had expected the police to handle it, to reinforce the unspoken rules that had kept Willow Creek the way it was. Instead, something was off. The officers had hesitated. The moment Shaq had said his name, the shift had been instantaneous. Recognition flickering across their faces, hands drifting away from their holsters. Karen had watched it happen with growing disbelief. They were supposed to back her up. They always did. Now the neighborhood was watching. More porches had lights flicked on. More neighbors had stepped outside. A few pretended to be watering their plants while others openly stood with arms crossed, waiting to see how this unfolded. Shaq exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he's been through this exact thing before. Then, he spoke. "You ever wonder why you're afraid of me, Karen?" His voice was low, steady, too steady. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She felt the weight of eyes on her, watching, waiting. I'm not afraid of you," she finally said, but the words rang hollow. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Then why'd you call the cops?" Karen's fingers twitched at her sides. "Because you were just sitting there, watching. It looked odd." Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. "Odd?" Karen's stomach twisted. He was making her sound ridiculous, turning the story upside down. "I was protecting my home," she said firmly, crossing her arms. Shaq's expression didn't change. "From what?" A silence stretched between them. The officers shifted uncomfortably. The neighbors held their breath. Karen swallowed hard. She had been so certain before, so sure that she was doing the right thing. But now, standing here with the weight of all these eyes on her, she felt something creeping in that she hadn't expected. Doubt. The whispers had started. She could hear them, even as she tried to focus on Shaq. She just called 911 because he was sitting there? This is embarrassing. You'd think she'd back down by now. She turned slightly, her gaze darting toward the neighboring houses. Some people avoided her eyes, while others looked straight at her, expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. Even Richard Lawson, the older neighbor who had always been on her side, had an uncertain look on his face. She could feel control slipping through her fingers. Shaq took a step forward, not threatening, not aggressive, just closing the space between them. "You know what I was thinking about before you called the cops on me?" he asked. Karen swallowed. I don't know." Shaq looked past her, like he was seeing something beyond this moment. "My mother. My childhood. The first time someone looked at me the way you just did and decided I was a problem before I even spoke." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had expected anger, shouting, a scene, something that would justify the decision she had made. Instead, Shaq's voice carried something she hadn't been prepared for. "I've spent my whole life being watched," Shaq continued. "Watched in stores, watched by security, watched by people clutching their purses a little tighter when I walk by. And it's funny, because all I've done, my entire life, is work to make this world a better place." Karen felt her face grow warm. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She had never seen herself as a bad person. She had always thought of herself as one of the good ones, someone who donated to charity, who volunteered, who believed in being kind. But tonight, standing here under the glow of porch lights and judgmental stares, she was starting to see herself through someone else's eyes. And she didn't like what she saw. One of the younger officers cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "Ma'am, do you want to press any formal complaints?" Karen's mouth opened. She almost said yes, out of reflex. But then she stopped. If she pushed this, if she doubled down, what would that make her? Would she be the woman who called the cops on Shaquille O'Neal for sitting outside his own home? Would she be the latest viral video? The next name trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons? Her throat felt dry. "No," she said finally, voice quiet. The officer nodded, almost relieved. "All right then, Mr. O'Neal, sorry for the mix-up." Shaq didn't respond. His eyes were still on Karen, watching, waiting. The officers stepped back toward their cars, radios crackling, the tension finally breaking as they got in and left. But Karen didn't move. She stood there, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. Shaq took another slow breath. Then, shaking his head, he turned and walked back toward his house. Karen had expected him to say something else, something to lash out, to make her feel worse. But he didn't. He didn't need to, because she already felt destroyed. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she deserved to be forgiven. The air felt heavy. Karen stood frozen, the whispers of her neighbors still ringing in her ears. The porch light above Shaq cast long shadows, stretching between them like an unspoken truth neither of them could walk away from. Shaq should have been done with this. He should have just gone inside, let the moment pass, and moved on like he always did. But something in him said no. Tonight was different. He turned back toward Karen, studying her carefully. She was still standing by her driveway, arms wrapped around herself, looking much smaller than before. The certainty in her eyes, the righteousness, the confidence, the privilege was cracking. Shaq exhaled. Then he made a decision. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "You ever hear the name William Calloway?" Karen blinked, startled by the sudden shift. "What?" Shaq took a slow step forward. "William Calloway," he repeated. "That name mean anything to you?" Karen hesitated. The name scratched at something distant, something buried. "That was my father's name." Shaq nodded. "Of course it was." "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know." Karen frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean you know?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, old, worn at the edges but still intact. He hesitated just for a second. Then, he handed it to her. Karen hesitated, staring at it like it was a bomb waiting to go off. "What is this?" Shaq's expression remained unreadable. "Something you need to see." Slowly, cautiously, Karen took the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. Her hands trembled. At first, she couldn't understand what she was looking at. Old letters, a few newspaper clippings, some handwritten notes, and then, a photograph. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her father, but not the version she had always known, the warm, respected businessman, the man who had taken her to school plays, who had stood at the head of their perfect dinner table. This was different. Darker. The photo was black and white, grainy but unmistakable. Her father stood in a crowd of men, smiling, laughing. And in the background, Karen's stomach turned to stone, a burning cross, a man hanging from a tree. She staggered backward. "No," she whispered. No, that's not real." Shaq didn't move. He just watched. "It's real, Karen," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "I wish it wasn't. But it is." Karen's breathing came in short, uneven bursts. She rifled through the rest of the papers, hands shaking. More photos, more documents, letters from her father, handwritten, addressed to known white supremacist groups, a police report from 1963, a name she didn't recognize listed as the victim, an accusation, a murder that had never been solved. Karen's entire world tilted on its axis. She looked up at Shaq, shaking her head wildly. This isn't possible. My father he wouldn't." Her voice broke. Shaq finally spoke. "I thought the same thing when I found out." Karen's heart stopped. Her eyes snapped to his. "What do you mean when you found out?" Shaq let out a slow breath. "Because that man in the report, the one who died." His voice dropped lower, heavier. "He was my uncle." The words hit like a wrecking ball. Karen staggered back again, her legs barely holding her up. "No," she whispered again. But this time it was empty. Shaq had already turned away, his gaze distant, lost in the weight of what he had just revealed. "My mother never told me," he said, almost to himself. "Not until I was older. She didn't want me carrying that anger. But I found out anyway. I found out what happened to him, what they did to him. And I found out about the people responsible." He turned back to her, and this time, his eyes were unreadable. "Your father was one of them, Karen." A coldness swept through her, a sickness curling in her stomach. Everything she had ever known about her family, about her father, about herself, had just shattered. She opened her mouth to say something, anything. But what was there to say? What could she say? She had spent years believing that she was one of the good ones, that racism was something other people did, something other people carried. And now? Now she was staring at the proof that the blood in her veins carried the very thing she had always denied. Her legs gave out. She sank to the curb, the papers slipping from her hands, drifting onto the pavement. The street was silent. The neighbors, still watching, were motionless. No one knew what to say. Shaq just stood there, the weight of history pressing down between them. Karen's voice came out broken. I didn't know. Shaq nodded, but there was no relief in it. I know. A long pause. Then softer this time he asked, what are you going to do now? Karen didn't answer, because for the first time in her life, she had no idea who she was anymore. The papers lay scattered on the pavement, some caught in the evening breeze, others crumpled beneath Karen's trembling hands. The world around her had become too loud, too suffocating, too real. She could still hear Shaq's words echoing in her head. Your father was one of them. Her stomach twisted violently. This wasn't just a bad night. This was the end of everything she thought she knew. But before she could fully process it, the world turned on its head. A voice cut through the heavy silence, sharp, disbelieving. Wait, what did he just say? It came from somewhere in the gathering crowd. The neighbors who had been watching quietly before were no longer silent. They murmured among themselves, shifting, eyes darting between Karen and Shaq. Some of them looked horrified, some just looked entertained, like this was some neighborhood soap opera unfolding in real time. And then, the dam broke. Are you serious? A woman's voice rang out, laced with disgust. Karen's father was a white supremacist? A man scoffed. That can't be true. Right, Karen? Karen felt her pulse explode in her ears. She lifted her head, her skin burning. No, it's not. It's not what it sounds like, she stammered, scrambling to her feet. But the damage was already done. Some were shocked. Some were angry. Others? They didn't know what to do. Jesus, Karen. A man in his 40s, Jason, who lived 2 houses down, shook his head. You call the cops on a guy sitting on his porch, and now we find out your father was part of this? He motioned to the papers still lying on the pavement. Karen felt sick. It's not like that, she insisted, voice rising. I didn't know, I swear I didn't. So what, it's fine because you were ignorant? Someone else shot back. Karen's eyes darted around wildly, desperate for an ally, for someone to step in and save her. But no one did, not this time. Social media moved faster than the fire spreading through the neighborhood. Someone had been recording. Of course they had. By the time Karen had stumbled back onto her driveway, the internet had already swallowed her whole. Phones glowed in the crowd. Twitter was already lighting up. Karen Calloway, Willow Creek HOA queen, called 911 on Shaq. Not only is she a racist, but her dad was literally KKK. She had no problem calling the cops on a black man, but now she's playing victim? Willow Creek is officially canceled. The words blurred together as she scrolled, her fingers shaking violently. Oh my God, she whispered. Her face was there, her name, her family history, plastered across a screen. The comments were rolling in so fast she could barely keep up. She looked up in panic, searching the crowd. Her neighbors would defend her. They had to. But instead, she saw them stepping away. Jason, Richard Lawson. Even Melissa, her closest friend in the neighborhood, had taken a step back. They weren't just judging her. They were distancing themselves. Karen felt something inside her shatter. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had always been the one in control, the one shaping the rules of the neighborhood. Now, she was the one being cast out. News vans arrived in less than an hour. The flashing lights, the cameras, the swarm of reporters. All of it turned Willow Creek into something Karen didn't recognize. She could barely keep up with the questions being hurled at her. Mrs. Calloway, is it true your father had ties to white supremacist groups? Do you regret calling the police on Shaquille O'Neal? Did you know about your family's past before tonight? Karen couldn't breathe. She turned, looking for her husband. Where was Greg? But he wasn't there. She was alone. The realization crashed into her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. There was no fixing this. No perfectly crafted apology statement. No explanation that would smooth this over. She had spent years benefiting from the silence of people like her. The ones who whispered behind closed doors, who stayed comfortable in their ignorance. But now the silence was gone. And without it, she had nothing left. Through the chaos, Shaq stood quietly. He watched as the truth took on a life of its own, spreading, twisting, consuming the neighborhood. This wasn't what he had wanted. He hadn't planned for this. But he wasn't sorry either. Karen had spent her life believing she was the one in control. But tonight, she had learned the truth. The world was bigger than Willow Creek, and for the first time ever, it was looking right at her. Karen Calloway had never been on this side of the story before. She was used to control, to shaping the narrative before it could shape her. For years, she had told herself she was a good person, a moral person, someone who stood on the right side of things. But tonight, she had become the villain. The news cameras, the phones capturing her every breath, the judgmental stares of her neighbors. All of it felt like a vice tightening around her throat. She was spiraling. The police officers were still there, but now, they weren't moving. They had been the first ones to come when she had called. They had arrived with their hands near their weapons, ready to handle what they thought was a threat. But now, they weren't looking at Shaq. They were looking at her, and worse, they weren't stepping in. For the first time, Karen saw what it felt like when the system didn't rush to protect her. Her breath hitched. "Are you just going to stand there?" she asked, her voice sharp, desperate. "Aren't you going to do something?" One of the officers, the same one who had first approached Shaq, shifted uncomfortably. "Do what, ma'am?" Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. What could she say? That she felt unsafe? That she was being threatened? That she was the victim here? Even she knew how hollow it would sound. The crowd had already judged her, and this time, the law wasn't here to clean up her mess. Her neighbors, the people she had once thought were her people, weren't looking at her the same way anymore. Jason, the man from 2 houses down, had his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had been her friend for years. Their families had barbecued together. Their kids had grown up together. But now he just shook his head. "You should have just walked away, Karen," he muttered. Karen's face burned. "Walked away?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Do you hear yourself? I was trying to protect my neighborhood." "Protect it from what?" Jason shot back. Karen opened her mouth, but she had no answer. Because the answer had been sitting there all along, staring her in the face, daring her to admit it. Shaq moved, not aggressively, not angrily, just stood up. His full height unfolded, his frame eclipsing the porch light, his shadow stretching long over the pavement. Karen took an instinctive step back. She had spent the entire night afraid of him, but now as he stood there, tall, unshaken, unbothered, she realized something. It wasn't fear she was feeling. It was shame. Shaq's eyes locked onto hers. He didn't look furious. He didn't look smug. He just looked tired and disappointed. Karen felt something crack in her chest, because that hurt more than anger ever could. "You don't get it, do you?" Shaq said finally, his voice quiet, but heavy. Karen swallowed hard. "Get what?" Shaq gestured toward the street, toward the cameras, the flashing lights, the people whispering about her name like it was a stain. "This," he said. "This is the first time you've ever felt it. The first time the world isn't just listening to your version of the story." Karen's fingers curled into fists. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Shaq tilted his head slightly. "You thought calling the cops would fix it, didn't you? Thought they'd come in, do what they always do, and I'd just..." He paused, his lips pressing together. "What? Disappear?" Karen shook her head wildly. "No, I wasn't trying to. I wasn't..." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "But that's what always happens, right? That's how the world works for you." Karen's breathing stuttered. Because he was right. For years, she had never questioned it. She had never thought twice about the system that had always protected her. The way her voice had always been the one people believed. The way the police had always been the ones standing on her side of the line. And tonight, that system had left her out in the cold. She had never felt this exposed, this powerless, this small. A noise broke through her panic, a familiar voice. Greg. Her husband had finally stepped outside, his robe tied loosely at the waist, his expression somewhere between confusion and horror. "Karen," he said, his voice strained. "What the hell is going on?" Karen turned to him desperately. "Greg, tell them. Tell them I didn't mean for this to happen." Greg's face tightened. Karen's stomach twisted. "Karen," he started, then stopped. And in that pause, Karen knew. He wasn't going to save her, not because he didn't love her, but because he couldn't. She had done this to herself. The weight of it all hit her at once. The neighbors' stares, the reporters' voices crackling in the distance, the social media notifications piling up like evidence against her very existence. And then, Shaq, still standing there, still watching, not angry, not amused, just waiting. Karen's breath hitched. Her mind screamed at her to fix this, to spin it, to do something. But for the first time in her life, she had nothing. No excuses, no explanations, no way out. And in that moment, the moment that broke her, she finally saw herself the way the rest of the world did, and she didn't like what she saw. Karen Calloway had spent her entire life believing she was one of the good ones. She had never used racial slurs, never openly disrespected anyone. She had donated to causes, posted about unity on social media, and nodded sympathetically whenever conversations about injustice came up at book club. She had never thought of herself as the problem. And yet, here she was. The street was still alive with whispers. The reporters hadn't left. The neighbors hadn't gone inside. The weight of 1,000 judgments pressed down on her, tightening around her throat, making it hard to breathe. Shaq stood there, unmoving. His presence was unshaken, unbothered, but the look in his eyes told her everything. He was waiting, not for an apology, not for some empty excuse, but for who she was going to become next. And Karen didn't know the answer. She could feel two choices forming in her mind. The first was easier, the one she had seen people like her make time and time again. Deny, deflect, play the victim. She could double down, insist she wasn't racist, claim she had been unfairly targeted, that this was all a misunderstanding. She could go on the news, cry, say her father's past wasn't her fault. People would defend her. Some of her neighbors were already itching to. She could feel it, their discomfort, their need for her to say something that would justify standing by her. She could see the path so clearly, a written statement, an interview about how things got out of hand, maybe even a lawsuit against the media for ruining her life. And for a split second, she wanted to take that path. Because the second choice? It was harder. It meant looking in the mirror and accepting that she had been wrong, that she had inherited something rotten and let it live inside her without ever questioning it. It meant owning the fact that the person she had always imagined herself to be, kind, decent, fair, had never truly existed. And that was terrifying. Karen swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She turned to Greg, desperate for guidance, but his face was unreadable. He wasn't going to make this choice for her. This was hers alone. Karen looked back at Shaq. He was watching her carefully, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something she hadn't expected. A challenge, not an offer of forgiveness. Not yet, but a question. Are you brave enough to change? Her throat tightened. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was. Karen turned to the crowd. The neighbors, the reporters, the strangers who would judge her no matter what she said next. And she did something she had never done before. She let herself feel it. The weight of everything, the history, the privilege, the ignorance she had wrapped around herself like a shield for years. She had spent her entire life avoiding this moment. But she couldn't anymore. Her hands were shaking. Her chest felt tight. And then, in a voice that didn't feel like her own, she whispered, "I was wrong." The words barely made it past her lips, but the effect was immediate. The street fell silent. Greg's face twitched. The reporters leaned in, waiting, hungry for more. But Karen wasn't speaking to them. She was speaking to Shaq. "I was wrong," she said again, this time louder, stronger. I called the cops because I was afraid. Because I saw you sitting there, and I told myself a story about who you were. And I didn't question it." Her voice broke. "I didn't question it, because I didn't have to." She felt the words cut her open as they left her mouth. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. And I know I'm not the only one who does it. A shift. A few people averted their eyes. Others stiffened. Jason, who had been one of the first to turn against her, nodded slightly. Karen took a shuddering breath. I spent my life thinking racism was something loud, something obvious, something I could point to and say, that's not me. She swallowed, her throat burning. But it's quieter than that, isn't it? A long, tense silence. And then, the question she had been dreading. Do you expect people to forgive you? The voice came from the crowd. Sharp, untrusting. Karen felt every muscle in her body tense, because she knew the answer. And she knew it wasn't the one people wanted to hear. No, she said quietly. I don't. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The reporters leaned in closer. Karen lifted her chin. I don't expect anyone to forgive me, she said, her voice steady now, because I haven't earned it. A flicker of movement. Shaq shifted slightly, watching her differently now. Karen felt the weight of his gaze and forced herself to hold it. But I want to do better, she said. Not just tonight, not just when people are watching. I want to actually change. The words felt foreign on her tongue. Because for the first time, they weren't just words. She meant them, and she was terrified. The silence stretched, and then Shaq nodded. Just once. Karen's breath hitched. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And right now, that was enough. Karen turned to the crowd, to the cameras, to the world watching her fall apart in real time. This would follow her. She would never be the same after tonight. But maybe that was the point. Because the person she had been deserved to be left behind. And the person she wanted to become? She had a lot of work to do. The night finally exhaled. The flashing red and blue lights had faded, the voices had quieted, and the crowd had begun to dissolve into the darkness. But even as the street emptied, the weight of what had happened refused to leave. The echoes of it would stay, whispered about in kitchens, debated in online forums, dissected by strangers who had never set foot in Willow Creek, but suddenly had opinions about it. Shaq had seen moments like this before, but for Karen, this was the moment that would define her forever. She had left without another word. No reporters trailing after her, no neighbors stopping her with forced sympathy. She had simply turned, her shoulders slumped in a way they never had before, and walked back into her house. And just like that, she disappeared. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and Karen Calloway was nowhere to be found. No more morning power walks with the HOA moms. No more forcing a smile at the farmer's market, pretending everything was normal. No carefully crafted public statements. She had simply gone silent. The world outside moved on without her, but her name lingered like a stain. For some, she had become a cautionary tale, a prime example of what happened when privilege met its reckoning. For others, she was the victim, another suburban woman canceled by the internet, the poor soul who had made a mistake and deserved a second chance. But for Shaq, she was already in the rearview mirror. Because this moment, this afternoon, this fight, this neighborhood, was just one in a long list of battles he'd been forced to fight. And he had no interest in reliving it. Shaq stood on his porch the next morning, the world strangely still. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the street, but it felt different now. He had lived here for years, but last night had changed something permanent. A few neighbors avoided eye contact when they passed. Others gave him hesitant nods, as if they were trying to rewrite the past in real time, pretending they had always been on his side. Shaq didn't care. He had learned a long time ago that people only stood for what was right when it was convenient for them. And yet, as he sipped his morning tea, he noticed something across the street. A for sale sign had been planted on Karen's lawn. She was leaving. The woman who had once believed she ran this neighborhood, the woman who had shaped its unspoken rules and enforced its silent exclusions, was finally stepping away. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was shame. Or maybe she just couldn't bear to live in a place where she had been forced to see herself clearly. Either way, she was gone. Shaq exhaled, watching as the wind nudged the for sale sign back and forth. It didn't feel like justice. It didn't even feel like closure. It just felt like another chapter closing. As the day stretched on, Shaq packed a gym bag and headed out. The world hadn't stopped moving. His life hadn't paused. There were kids to mentor, communities to uplift, people who needed more than just words on a screen. This was never about one confrontation or one woman's reckoning. This was about the fight that never ended, the one he would always be part of, whether he wanted to be or not. And as he stepped onto the sidewalk, a reporter, one of the few still lingering, hurried toward him, microphone ready. "Mr. O'Neill, do you have any final words about what happened last night?" Shaq adjusted the strap on his bag and looked past her, toward the horizon, toward something bigger than all of this. Then finally he answered, "You can wake up or stay blind, but the truth will always find you." And with that, he walked away. Some truths are too big to ignore. Some conversations are too important to walk away from. What happened that night in Willow Creek? It's not just a story, it's a mirror. Look closer, ask the hard questions. And when the truth finds you, don't turn away.